Hello, church. I don't have a special intro for you this week. Um, I just want to get right into the message today. And I'm sure that we've all had some sort of similar experience this week, um, in that it's been a pretty emotionally taxing week for uh, for us as a nation. Um, Never mind that we're in the middle of a pandemic still, and many of us are nearing the end of the school year or will have completed the end of the school year lately. And there's plenty of stress involved in both of those things. But of course, this week has been marked by some very sad and disturbing events. Uh, and of course, it starts off early in the week with um, the disturbing, the disgusting, uh, murderous, violent acts that we saw against George Floyd, and all of that happening in a state that I love, in the state in which I was born, Minnesota, and the ensuing protests and demonstrations, and then eventually also the riots that we've been seeing. I'm recording this on a Saturday afternoon, so I don't know what else will transpire throughout the rest of the weekend, but plenty has happened already that it's enough to that we need to talk about it. And so the message I have today is coming from that place, and I'm sure all of us have those events on our hearts. And uh, I want to talk today from Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12 is an important text and a sort of a divinely appointed text, I guess you might say. You already know that I choose my text most of the time based on a preset schedule, the lectionary text, and one of the texts for this week happens to be Romans 12, which I think has a lot to say to our current situation, our current condition as human beings and as a church. And I'll tell you where I'm coming from today. I have two things on my mind in particular. We'll get to both of them. Obviously, the events related with the injustice regarding George Floyd, and the protests and the riots and all of that stuff. I also have on my mind and my heart the idea of reopening our church for corporate assembly and worship and all that goes into that. And so I come to the text, as we all do, in the context of those things, in the context of thinking about church and reopening and all that goes into that. And of course, the political, social, civil climate that we're in right now. I wanted to talk. I'm going to get to the point being made that violence isn't the answer, just so you know. I don't think that's a surprise. But I do think that it's important to understand, or try to understand, why these events are happening in our culture. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about that in the news media and that sort of thing, the importance of trying to understand. And I think that is an important starting point for us as a church, gathered together on the internet on a Sunday morning. If there's one quote that we've all seen this weekend, it's the one by Martin Luther King Jr., that riot is the language of the unheard. And I think that's an important reflection to take into account here. the reason, well, I think all human behavior makes sense. There's a reason why we do every single thing that we do. There's a reason why you get mad or I get mad, for whatever reason, on a daily basis. There's a reason why we respond to someone the way that we respond to them when we're driving on the roads, or when we run into someone on the street or whatever. We all have a reason for what we're doing. There's a reason why riots occur. There's a reason why all of the behaviors that we're seeing, why those occur across the nation and major cities across our nation. We see those things, and it's part of it has to do with what Dr. King said, that riot is the language of the unheard. There's a message that has yet to be received and acted on, and we have to admit that and take that seriously and act on that. And what is that message about? It's about injustice. It's about injustice, and a cry for equality, a cry for us to all really finally understand that we are all the same, that we're all here in this world, in this life together, and that message is too long in being ignored, for too long, for too many decades, too many generations, too many centuries, too many millennia, that we have yet to really believe and live that out as a human species, that we're all in this together, that we're all equal, and to live like that. How do we arrive at that place, and what's the goal of that? Obviously, the goal is peace. What is the message that you hear all week long? That we can't have peace unless there is justice, right? You've heard that being said over and over again, that we are not going to have the peace that's desired as a society unless there is justice. And I think that is a biblical message. I think that is absolutely true. I think that's what Jesus was about, and I think that's obviously we'll see that's what Paul is about as well. Peace is the goal of humanity. Peace was the pinnacle, the end of creation. That shalom, that peace, was the goal of creation in the Genesis narratives. That's something that's central and incredibly important to us as human beings. We want peace because that when there's peace, when there's shalom, that represents and indicates that all is well, that everything is the way that it's supposed to be. And how do we arrive at that? That's the question that the Gospels are trying to answer. That's the question that the church is trying to work out in the first century, that these documents record for us. What does that mean? How do we arrive at peace? And Martin Luther King Jr., who says the words that riot is the language of the unheard, is famously, about nonviolence. And I think that he and that Jesus and that Paul and that plenty of other important voices that we listen to all agree on this one point. And I think this is the difference. This is the difference between Jesus and the gospel that he was standing up against. There's always two competing gospels, two different worlds at war with one another. And they both have the same ostensible goal, peace. In Jesus' day, there was a peace that was ostensibly achieved by the Roman Empire. And if you understand the way that that peace is achieved and maintained, you understand why Jesus stands against it. Or hopefully you do, because that's what the gospel is about. Peace, true peace, cannot be obtained via power, via violence. Peace through violence, peace through power is only peace for some, not for all. And it's a pseudo peace. The true peace that Jesus means to achieve comes through one way, and that is through justice. Peace through justice. And this isn't going to be a whole, I could do a 5-hour video on what that means, justice, but that word is important. I think that's what Paul has already been talking about in Romans prior to Romans 12. He uses that exact language about justice bringing about peace. Read Romans chapter 5. It's exactly about that the justice brought about through Jesus results in peace. It's peace through justice. So that is a very biblical cry when we have people crying out, saying that there is no such thing as peace unless there is justice. Well, Jesus agrees with that. He has a different world that he imagines. And it's a world of peace that comes through justice. It's a world reimagined in the mind of Jesus, and that's the world that he dies for. He dies for that justice and for that peace. And we need to take that message seriously as Christians, because that is the gospel message. But how do we go about living that out? That is, of course, the question, and a question that I want to invite you, as I am in the habit of doing, to explore on your own this Sunday, Lord's Day. What does justice look like, and how do we get there? Now, when we look at Romans chapter 12, I think there are some really good fundamental, foundational layer principles about what that world looks like, and how we get there as a society, but first and foremost as a church. Jesus or Paul or whoever we're talking about in the New Testament, or in the first century, when they reimagine this world, Paul especially, when he reimagines this world of peace based on justice, Paul believes that world begins with the church. That if there's anyone in this world who is going to be living this out, then it has to start with the church. And just as with Jesus, so Paul and those early Christians, it was totally antithetical to the ways of the other world, the normal world, the world that's trying to achieve peace by power, by violence, by some sort of victory won over others. So when Paul's reimagining a world, it's based in the gospel of Jesus, and it's based on the idea that it starts with the church. If the church can't get this right, we have no reason to expect or stand in judgment of the rest of the world who doesn't know how to do peace. If we can't get that right on our own, then this whole world's in a lot of trouble, and there's really very little hope for anything to be turned around. But Paul believes the church can, because of the Spirit, because of the Spirit of Christ. This Sunday is Pentecost Sunday, and the church celebrates the sending and receiving of the Holy Spirit that empowers the church to do and to live out the very things that Paul talks about in Romans chapter 12. I want to spend some time looking at Romans chapter 12. And again, we have this vision, I want to apply it directly to the church. I think there's a lot of stuff in Romans 12 that I think applies on a general level to the entire situation that we're dealing with as a nation, as a world. But I want to apply it specifically to us in our context as a church. And we can do that, like I said, I have in my mind, for example, how do we go about reopening our church for corporate assembly worship? What things do we need to do to make that happen and to make that a success? And ultimately, in what spirit will I go into those discussions, and then ultimately into the assembly when we're gathering together? What will be my attitude? What will be my spirit when I do that? And when we read Romans 12, it's very convicting. At least it is for me. I think you'd be hard pressed to read through Romans 12 and not find at least something that convicts you and shows where you could do a better job, where you're in error, where you're in sin. It certainly is a text that does that quite easily for me. I'm going to assume that you've already been through the text, that you've read all of Romans 12. So if you haven't, take a chance, an opportunity to do that right now, as I do a bit of an overview of Romans chapter 12 here. And he begins, of course, with therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice. So this whole world reimagined in Romans chapter 12 is dependent upon the idea of the gospel of Jesus and the mercies of God. I have a footnote in my Bible here that says, to understand this verse, see Romans 1 through 11. So that would be a good starting point. I guess we just have to read the whole book. But by the mercies of God, expressed, demonstrated in Jesus, the Messiah. Because of that, here's the way that we do church. Here's the way that the world is supposed to be. It's a reimagining of the world. Or you could call it something like Paul's guidelines for the church, whatever you want to say. These are the things that Paul sees as most important. Present your bodies a living sacrifice, living and holy sacrifice acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship or act of worship. And here we have the definition of worship in the first place, which is interesting. How do you define worship? Is it everyone meeting together and everyone fighting to get their own way in something? No, it's about being a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to God. It's sacrificial in nature. It's giving up of the self rather than the other way of doing life. Yeah. Speaking of which, verse 2, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Once again, the ways of the world are evident. It's the main way that we do stuff. And by the way, it's the main way we're prone to doing stuff in the church. Whether we're talking about peace through exercising power rather than peace through justice, or take any other topic or concept. It's a struggle for the church to do things by the gospel rather than by the ways of the world. That's why Paul has to tell the church in Rome this. Don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Reimagine the different world according to the gospel and begin to live that out so that you may prove what the will of God is, what is good and acceptable and perfect. He goes on to discuss different gifts of the church, that it's important for the church to understand that every single person is important to this picture and to this world reimagined. Whoever you are, wherever you're from, whatever distinctions we try to make between each other, those do not matter in the church, in the gospel, and we're all in this together. But God gives us different gifts so that we can work together to make this world happen, this world that's reimagined. But ultimately, I want to get to verses 9 and following. And you could just read through the text, and every line is its own sermon. It's a really powerful section of Scripture here. But I want you to note that it begins and ends bookmarked with this word good at the end of verse 9 and at the end of verse 21. This is bookended with goodness, part of that vision here for a world reimagined and a church that lives out that world, that picture, has to do with goodness. The very word that's repeated in that creation narrative in Genesis. God calling things good and very good. That's part of this recreated, reimagined world that God has brought about through Jesus. And he begins in verse 9 by saying, let love be without hypocrisy. If the rule is you can't read the next line until you know how to do the one you just read, then we're not going to get very far here. But let love be without hypocrisy. What does that look like in your life? What does that mean? What is love with hypocrisy? And then, of course, what would love look like without hypocrisy? An important question, but love is sort of the headline here. Let love be without hypocrisy. What is unhypocritical love look like? What is this reimagined world with unhypocritical love? It begins with something that has to do with goodness, abhorring evil, clinging to what is good. He talks about brotherly love in verse 10. Give preference to one another in honor. So giving preference to someone else rather than to me. Honor someone, lift them up, rather than trying to lift up myself. I think that is going to, all these are really, really important lines, but that's a huge factor, isn't it? When we're reopening a church for worship after, spending so many months not doing so, there's going to be, in a church of 100 people, there's going to be 110 different opinions of what we're supposed to do. I am like everyone else. I have strong opinions, really strong opinions about what needs to be done and how to do it. And I think all of us care enough about the church that we all have strong opinions about what that is, when church should reopen, how we should do it, what that's supposed to look like, that sort of thing. And so this is going to be a challenge for us as a church, to love without hypocrisy, to cling to what is good, to be devoted to each other in brotherly love, to give preference to one another and to honor one another. What does that look like? We got to start thinking about that prayerfully already, long before we ever meet together, to prepare our hearts and minds for what this is going to look like, because I don't think it's any secret, if we have 110 different opinions about what's supposed to happen, there's not going to be anyone that's totally satisfied in what it looks like. And when that happens, not if, but when that happens, we're going to have to learn how to be a church who knows how to give preference to one another in honor, and learns how to love one another without hypocrisy. Be fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, verse 11. Contributing to the needs of the saints, verse 13. Practicing hospitality. The text goes on and on. And there's so much here to look at. I hope that and I want to encourage you to spend some time in the text of Romans 12 today, because it's such an important text. I think if we want to post guidelines for reopening a church, Romans 12 has to be a part of those guidelines, because everything in here is about living out the Spirit of Christ in how we come together as a church and how we live together and worship together as a church. But I just want to share a quick list. I wrote in the margin of my Bible, I kind of went down these verses here, verses 9 through 21, and I tried to give a one-word description of what Paul is talking about here. What is being discussed? I just want to read that list to you, and have this as a summary of what the text is saying here. And I think this is a good checklist, a good list of priorities for us to have, because this is the world reimagined by the gospel of Jesus. What is that world? What do those people look like? What ought the church to be when we come back together? And here's the list: love, goodness, preference for one another, honor, service, generosity, hospitality, blessing, empathy, humility, consideration, peacekeeping, non-retaliation, compassion, and of course at the end, goodness. Peacekeeping is there right in the middle as central to this list of priorities, this list of a church, of guidelines for a church in a world reimagined. Peacekeeping, consideration, non-retaliation, compassion, humility, blessing, empathy, all of those things are so important when we come back together, because it's like we said, like I said, it's not going to be easy. There's going to be differences of opinion about what we should do, but ultimately the decisions that we come to as a church leadership, and the way that we approach and re-engage in the public corporate assembly as a church family has to be about this, or else we've already lost. If we can't do that with showing preference and honor to one another, if we can't do that with generosity and empathy for each other, and humility, consideration, and a concern for keeping peace in our assembly, then we've already lost. No matter if someone thinks they get their way, then the church is already lost. So the most important thing is to reconvene with these Christ-like attitudes and be preparing our hearts and our minds to approach that, to approach worship in that way, in that spirit. So there's plenty more to be said, but I think I've already talked for too long here. So I want to offer the Lord's blessings to you on this Lord's Day.